In the last section, we signed up for the YouTube API. In this section, we're going to go off on a little bit of a tangent before we start making use of that API key. So instead of working with any of the data from YouTube just yet, we're going to start by working on the search bar first. In setting up the search bar, we're going to cover three very important topics: exporting modules, classes, and state. Once we've discussed these three concepts, we'll come back to working with the data from the YouTube API. So let's work on the search bar for a bit by opening searchbar.js. So the purpose of this component, again, is just to make sure that we have an input at the top that the user can type in. When they type into the input, it should update the video list on the right-hand side. So basically, user types input, we need to make an API request to the YouTube API. So we haven't done anything in here just yet, but we do know that we need a text input. And when a user types something in, we need to do a search of some sort. So let's define our component first in the same way that we define the one inside of index.js. We'll say const search bar, and we'll define a function and return just an input. We don't need to close the input because, with like a closing input, because we're not going to put anything inside this component. So this will generate an HTML input that a user can type, text into. One other thing, even though we're not making reference to a variable called, React in here, we still need to include it. So we'll write import React from React at the top. We need to do this because remember, whenever we translate the JSX to normal JavaScript, it turns into a call like react.createElement. And so if React isn't in the scope of this file, well, it's going to throw an error. So we just need to make sure that we import React into all of our components that we write that have JSX. Okay, so this is just going to show a no-frills input. Now, we need something to make sure that the user can see it, or we need to do something to make sure that the user can see it right now. All we've done right now is define the component. It's not being rendered to the DOM. It's not being rendered inside of index.js. So do remember that React components can show other components. So if we get this search bar component over into index.js, we can use index.js to show the input. Just one problem. To render the search bar, index needs a reference to this. And remember, as we mentioned previously, all of our files are siloed from each other unless we explicitly declare a connection between the two of them. So we already learned how to import files, but we haven't yet discussed how to export code, right? We haven't learned what's happening on the other side of this React, of this import statement right here. So think about it for a second. A given file might have a ton of different code in it, but we only want to export a small amount or a subset of the code that we've written in here. So to make sure that the only code that we export from this file is this component right here, we'll write at the bottom export default search bar. Now, any file in our application that imports search bar will get our search bar component. It's kind of confusing in words, so let's go through it in practice and see what it actually looks like. I'm going to save this file, and then we'll flip back over to index.js, and at the top, we'll write import search bar from search_bar. So now when search bar is imported into this file, search bar will be equal to search bar right here, which is the component. Okay? So the distinction I want to draw here is if we had some other variable inside of here, let's say like const foo equals 5. If we instead wrote export default foo, search bar over here would be equal to 5, not the component. So it's very critical to make sure that we correctly export the component outside of each file. So I'm going to delete this, and we'll replace it with search bar like so. Okay, one more thing. Sure would be great if we could just write, import search bar from search_bar, and then expect Babel to correctly determine that, okay, they want search bar, they must mean searchbar.js inside of the components folder. Well, unfortunately, it's not quite the case. Whenever we import code from a file that we write as a developer, an actual JavaScript file inside of here, we have to give an actual file reference to the file that we're trying to import. We don't have to do that with libraries that we import because they're namespaced, right? We can only have one installed package called React. That literally means import React from React literally means go into the node modules folder and get the directory called React. Same thing with React DOM. Juxtapose that with the search bar file. I could have 10 files inside of my project right here called search_bar.js, and Babel would just have no idea which of those different files I was asking for. So whenever we are working with our own files, whenever we're importing our own files, we have to give an actual file reference. So what that means is we write the actual relative path from the file that we're importing it from. So we're importing search bar into index.js. So what we'll write here is in the current directory, represented by a dot and then /, go into the components folder, components, there we go, and then find the file called search_bar. We don't need to include the file extension on here so long as it is a .js file. So again, if it's a file that we write, that we create ourselves, we have to provide a file reference or folder reference, a path reference to it. But if it's a library that we installed with npm, we can just write the name of the package. Okay, so we've now successfully imported our search bar into index.js, and now we want to show it inside of app. So this is going to be the first time that we show one component inside of another. Fortunately, as you might imagine, it's really straightforward. I'm going to delete the hi statement here, and then I'm going to enter a new line. So we'll add our search bar inside of this existing div by just writing search bar, like so. For a multi-line JSX expression like this, usually we'll use parentheses and put all the JSX inside of it, like so. So you can kind of imagine, this looks something like, hey, return this big old glob of JSX right here, wrapped in the parentheses. If you don't want to use the parentheses, you definitely don't have to. Just make sure that this div right here ends up on this first line right here, otherwise you'll get an error. Okay, so we've now declared a new component called search bar that contains just an input. We exported that component from this file. We imported it into index.js, and then we rendered it inside of our app component. Our app component is being rendered into the div inside of our index.html file with class container. So you can kind of imagine, this is starting to form a tree of sorts, a tree of components. At the very top level, we have our app, and then the first child inside of there is search bar. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and save this and then flip back over to my browser. Let's refresh, and it looks like we've got an input here. Cool, this looks good. Let's go ahead and continue inside the next section.